Commission. My name's Graham Roy and I'm Chair of the Commission. I'm joined today by two of my fellow Commissioners, Eleanor Ryan and Justine McComany, and also joined by Claire Murdoch from the Fiscal Commission team. And what we want to do today is give you an overview of our recent report looking at fiscal sustainability perspectives, what Scotland's finances mean for the next Parliament. And what we're going to do today is follow the usual format where we'll give you an overview of the report and Eleanor and Justine will walk you through some of the key insights. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up for Q&A and we'll use Slido for that. So there's two ways to access Slido. One is to go to the Slido webpage and type in that code, or secondly, take a screenshot of that QR code and that will take you through to the Slido page. And we'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible. But without further ado, what I'll do is I'll hand over to Eleanor, who's going to kick off the conversation about our report. Eleanor.
I think, in fact, Justine is going to cover the first section on funding and spending, and I will join in a bit later.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Eleanor. Thanks, Graham. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to look at funding and spending in this first section. So, in this slide, we can see that the block grant is still the dominant part of the funding for the Scottish Government. It's risen steadily over the 2021-22 to 25-26 timeline from just over 38 billion to 41.3 billion in this current year, where it makes up almost 80% of the total resource funding. However, the increases to other elements of the budget have decreased the block grant's share of the total budget. 21-22, as you can see, was an extraordinary funding year due to additional COVID funding, but from 22-23 onwards, the total resource or day-to-day spending funding has risen by 2.8% on average, excuse me. There are two other parts to the resource funding, though, in addition to the block grant, and these are fiscal framework funding, which includes devolved taxation, social security, block grant adjustments, which include IFRS 16 adjustments, and also borrowing and the Scotland Reserve. And a deduction is made from that figure for the servicing of past debt. And other funding sources include non-domestic rates revenue, and Scotland's share of the migrant surcharge and Scottish Crown estate. In 25-26, this amounted to 7.8% of the resource funding, but it fluctuates year on year. Social security block grant adjustments have become an important source of funding during the current Parliament, as we can see on the slide by the red-coloured blocks. In 21-22, this funding represented 7.6% of the budget, but it now represents 11.1% in the latest year. This is driven by devolution of the cold weather payments in 22-23 and winter fuel payments in 24-25, and also by the rising prevalence of disability in the rest of the UK and the spending associated with that, which we'll come on to later. Looking at the tax net position, which is the green block, in every year of this Parliament, except for 22-23, the net position, which is the result of subtracting the value of block grant adjustments from the value of the net of the devolved tax revenues, has been a positive, which adds money into the Scottish purse. This is due to decisions made by the Scottish Government to increase tax rates and leave the tax band thresholds as they are for higher earners. And one thing to note, though, is that all of that said, the Scottish tax base is not performing as well as the rest of the UK. And our report sets out commentary on the tax base performance gap for this purpose. And the tax base performance gap is measured as the difference between differences in policy and the Scottish income tax net position. And the next slide illustrates this. So let's have a look at this. Why do we talk about the income tax net position? Because it tells us what the level of impact is of devolving income tax since 2016-17, when it all began. In 2018-19, Scotland decided to change its income tax bands, diversifying, as we know, from the 3 existing tax bandings in the rest of the UK. Since then, the net position's been positive and it's remained so. Of course, the 5-band system is now a 6-band system, and Scotland has also chosen to use its powers to vary the thresholds and tax rates from those in the rest of the UK. Meanwhile, in the same period, the UK hasn't changed any of its 3 tax rates and made small changes only to the thresholds. And decisions around the personal allowance remain reserved to the UK. On this slide, you can see that the teal line, which is the policy only difference that I was just speaking about in the last slide, and the purple line is the income tax net position. The difference between these 2 lines is the tax-based performance gap. The teal line is an illustration of what the income tax revenue would look like if aggregate earnings and employment growth matched that of the rest of the UK. Currently, we calculate that the tax-based performance gap is sitting at 0.8 billion in 2026-27. In our January fiscal forecast, we set out a table about this on page 76, which is actually represented by the same sort of graph in graph format rather on this slide. So for 2026-27, the teal line was 1.8 billion, and we projected the net income tax position at 1 billion. So you take one away from the other and you get 0.8 billion. In the table, the performance gap is also shown as a percentage of Scottish income tax revenues. And it's interesting to notice that the gap is closing over time. So why might the gap have actually arisen? This could be due to differences in economic performance between Scotland and the rest of the UK, behavioural responses to income tax changes. The Scottish economy may have a differently configured sectoral makeup, and there may be differences in the income distributions between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Overall, we expect that policy differences between the UK and Scotland will see the net income tax position increasing, but I'd caveat that by saying that although we forecast a faster growth in average Scottish earnings, so we forecast a growth of 2.8% in 27-28 compared to the OBR's 2.1% for the UK's average earnings, it may be the case that UK earnings catch up a little, which would squeeze the income tax net position if the UK and Scotland's earnings growth turns out to be more aligned. So let's move on to the next slide. In 2016-17, the higher rate threshold was the same in Scotland and the rest of the UK. And at that point, there were more higher rate taxpayers in the rest of the UK than there were in Scotland. So 15.3% was the exact figure as opposed to 12.1% here. So this can be seen at paragraph 1.24 of our current report. The subsequent diversions in the higher rate threshold means that there's a higher incidence of higher rate taxpayers now since 2019-20, and that number of higher rate taxpayers is growing at a faster rate than in the rest of the UK. So by way of an example on this, for 2026-27, we've projected that due to fiscal drag, the ratios are Scotland 26.3% and the rest of the UK is 21.9%. But by 2030-31, we project that the ratio will be 29.5% in Scotland compared to 24.1% in the rest of the UK, and that 1 million individuals are likely to be higher rate taxpayers, assuming the rates and bands in Scotland stay as they are. And to put that into context, I read recently in the National Record of Scotland's annual review of demographic trends, which was published on the 2nd of December 2025, the Scotland's population was 5.5 million. So it gives you a bit of an illustration there. In paragraph 1.25 of our report, we discuss the fact that we expect there to be an increase in higher rate taxpayers of 8.3%, or an upward movement of around 350,000 people. In the rest of the UK, an increase of 4.3% is expected for the same period. And the reason for this is that there are a high number of taxpayers at or just below the Scottish higher rate threshold of 43,662 who will get dragged into higher rates simply by virtue of a pay rise or a bonus or something. So the rest of the UK threshold is still £50,270. So there's also an anomaly, which, you know, I've talked about many, many times over the years in terms of national insurance. Because national insurance threshold mirrors the UK higher rate threshold, employed Scottish income taxpayers face a higher overall tax burden than their rest of UK counterparts on £6,608 of their income in the middle earnings band, due to a 42% tax charge and an 8% national insurance charge in Scotland, which is a 50% tax band, really, as opposed to 28% effective tax rate south of the border. So I'll just move on to the next slide. Thank you, Eleanor. So this one's about social protection. I'll just move on to this where it covers day-to-day or resource spending, as we call it. We use COFOG categories to track spending because it remains consistent over time, regardless of any portfolio reshuffles that might happen. So in this slide, you can see that resource spending has grown by 8.1% in real terms over this Parliament. So that is to say 22-23, because 21-22 was skewed by additional COVID resource money, and then we've chosen to exclude that from our calculations. So we can see from this chart, social protection, which includes all devolved social security payments, has grown the most by 31%, actually. Health spend and general public services have grown in line with the overall budget, whereas economic affairs, public order and education have all had decreases in spend. You can see the figures that are set out at page 11 of our report on this. Back in 21-22, the block grant adjustments for social security amounted to 90% of spend, but by 24-25, this had dropped to 84% of spend, and we're expecting it to remain at that level in the next parliamentary term. So I'll just leave you with Eleanor now. Thank you.
Thanks, Justine. So I just want to pick up and talk briefly about some of the cross-cutting themes for the next Parliament that we highlight in our report. And Justine has already talked a lot about funding and spending, but let's just pause for a moment on the funding outlook. First of all, the day-to-day funding, or as Justine said, the resource funding outlook. If you look at the purple line, resource funding is growing across at least on current projections, across the term of the next Parliament. But if you look at the teal coloured line, in real terms, after adjusting for inflation, that growth looks much less. Really not quite flat, but growing very, very slowly over that period. And given ongoing demands on spending that we'll talk about, that is going to be quite a challenge. If we look at capital funding, again, the purple line in nominal terms, it maybe looks, it grows in 26-27, but then is relatively flat. But if you look at the teal line, you'll see capital funding declining in real terms. I should just say that we use, by convention, we use the GDP deflator when we're looking at inflation adjustments for all public spending. There are arguments and quite cogent arguments about capital funding and perhaps the rising construction costs may be rising faster than general inflation, which might make this even more challenging. But regardless, it's not an easy capital funding outlook. There's also a very important thing here about public sector workforce. So this chart shows you that the overall public sector workforce has been growing after a period where it fell slightly in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis. the overall public sector workforce fell slightly, but it has been once again returned to growth, and in fact hit an all-time high in 24-25. This is the devolved workforce in Scotland, hit an all-time high in 24-25. If you look at the blocks of this, local government staffing has shrunk. Part of that is the impact of the police and fire centralisation, that one-off step change, which you see where we have the dotted line. And the NHS workforce has been growing, meeting demand over that time. What we call the devolved workforce is basically everything else. It's all of the central government devolved workforce. So it includes Scottish Government, but it also includes a lot of Scottish public bodies that are delivering services in Scotland. That grows in a step, offsetting the shrinking from local government at the point of police and fire centralisation, but it has been growing otherwise, reflecting the devolution of services, for instance, Social Security Scotland, and all the other policies going on. This really matters because more than half, maybe 55% or more of the resource budget, that day-to-day funding that we were talking about, is spent on the salaries of public sector workers. And so there's an issue about how many public sector workers you have. There's also an issue about their pay. The Scottish Government set a pay policy over 3 years, which was capped at 9%. A lot of the bigger workforce groups have done 2-year settlements within that, which have accounted for perhaps getting close to 8%, 7.8 or so percent over 2 years. So there is a question mark around how realistic it is to stay with that 9% capped pay rises over 3 years policy. For our forecasts in January, we made an assumption that pay would rise in line with inflation, but it's something that post-election any incoming Scottish Government is going to have to grapple with, the demands for pay and the size of the workforce. Current Scottish Government has mapped plans where it's going to shrink the workforce by 0.5% per annum as part of its overall savings to help bring spending demand and funding back into line. Obviously, if pay grows more quickly, that will put pressure on those plans, and you might have to think again about the size of the workforce. And we know that since we did our forecasts in January, the inflationary pressures are only growing. We've seen all the things happening in the Middle East, the oil price rising. This is likely to increase pressure, likely to increase inflation. That may make it an even more challenging outlook on public sector pay. So this is a really important theme for any Scottish Government post-election. Another thing just to pause on is the effect of the devolution of social security spending and the decisions taken around social security spending on the Scottish budget. So you look at this and you think, why is this a big negative number? What this chart actually shows is the difference between the block grant adjustment, that's the money that is given to Scotland to reflect the fact that the benefits that have been devolved no longer need to be funded by the UK government. So they hand over the money that they would have spent to Scotland. And that's the Social Security block grant adjustment. So this chart shows the difference between that block grant adjustment, the funding given by the UK, and the amount that is actually been spent or projected to be spent. And you'll see that in outturn, it started slightly negative and it grew more negative over time. And when we were doing our forecasts in June of last year to go with the Scottish Government's medium-term financial strategy, we were actually projecting that this social security spending might be more than £2 billion higher than the block grant adjustment by 2030-31. But when we forecast in January, we're saying that might be around 1.2 billion. And what's going on there? So the bulk of that difference is actually driven by UK government decisions. The UK delayed planned changes to the Personal Independence Payment, PIP, and it also changed its policy around the two-child limit. And most of that 0.8 billion difference in these two lines, this teal line and the purple line, is actually driven by UK decisions. The rest, there is a small forecasting difference as well. Why is Scottish social security spending outrunning the block grant adjustment? Well, there's a number of factors. There are policy decisions about eligibility and benefits and so on, including Scottish child payment. There's growth in the prevalence of disability, and we're going to talk a bit, Justine's going to talk in a bit more detail about that later on. So there's a mix of changes, effects going on in the world that are changing demand, and policy decisions that have been taken. But you can see that there's a very, very big difference in the outlook, and that big difference is driven very largely by UK government decisions. So there's a need to keep an eye on what's going on in terms of demand for social security. There's a need to think carefully about policies around social security, but there's also understanding what the UK is doing and what impact that will have through the fiscal framework and what's happening in spending in Scotland. So those were some big cross-cutting themes that the next Scottish Parliament, the next Scottish Government will have to think about. And in our report, we set out what we consider is the in-tray for the next Scottish Government. And we pick up here a few of the points. There's much more detail in the report. I commend it to you. It's a great read. But we just pick up a few of the themes here just to for discussion in this webinar. So as an overview, I think the key thing we're trying to convey here is that political parties need to be clear about what Scottish Government can afford and the impact on public spending for people in Scotland. We are not trying to set out anything about what those choices should be. Those are policy decisions for government. Parties need to say where they would be if they were forming the next Scottish Government. It is simply that if they want to spend more money on certain things, they need to be very honest about where they're going to make savings, because the outlook is challenging. There are quite a few big ticket pressures, and we've pulled out a few of them. We're going to talk a bit about living standards in a moment. We have an aging population. I think it's important around the aging population to recognise that although we've been talking about this for years and years, it's not a sort of nebulous thing that might happen in a few decades' time. It's happening now, and it will start to have an impact over the course of the next Parliament in a way that you can actually see through the forecasts and the funding. We're going to talk a bit about disability prevalence. Obviously, climate change is also a huge factor. And again, where we're talking about UK versus Scotland, the issue is not only what might Scotland need to do to manage and mitigate and respond to the effects of climate change, but also how is that different from the pressures and the demands in England and the policy choices that are made in England, and how will that then flow through in the funding through the fiscal framework? There are growing pressures on services across the board. People will be very aware of pressures on the NHS, on waiting lists, and expectations of performance. Audit Scotland have reported around this. These are not things that can be ignored, and funding, it isn't, sometimes it is possible to increase the performance of services without putting more money in, but not always or usually. And so that is definitely a factor. And the Parliament has declared a housing emergency And that also, there are plans around investment in housing, but that's something that needs to be taken into account by all parties as they're thinking about their priorities and what can be done with public spending. So I said we'd say a little bit about living standards, and I just want to draw attention to this. So what we have here is the growth in average disposable income. So we have here a figure of just shy of 3% per annum between 1999-2000, that's the point of devolution, up to 2007-8, which was the start of the global financial crisis. And over that period, on average, over those years, real disposable incomes grew by around 3% or just under 3% per year. Since the global financial crisis, from 2008-9 to 2024-25, the figure has been below 1%. And our forecast around all of this is shown as well, and it stays below. It's very low for 25-26, and it's growing, but it's staying below 1% up to 2030-31. And the point of talking about living standards like this is to try to make all these nebulous things about the economy and growth in GDP feel real. If people can hear that the economy is performing well, that's lovely, but what people will experience is really represented in this living standards chart, what they will feel about their own finances. And of course, all this is averaged, and of course it may be masking differences by different income groups and so on. But even overall, it is not a happy outlook. And as I mentioned earlier, this was all based on forecast in January, and pressures on inflation are only continuing to grow, given what's happening in the Middle East. So it may, in fact, if we were redoing it, it may, in fact, start edging in the wrong direction. So a really important factor for the next Scottish Government, the next Scottish Parliament to grapple with is how to improve economic performance, because that's what's eventually going to drive that better growth in living standards and real disposable incomes, and people actually recognizing and getting benefit from economic well-being. So I'm going to hand over, that was one of the in-tray issues. I'm going to hand over to Justine because she's going to talk about disability prevalence now.
Thank you, Eleanor. Right, so let's have a look at this slide about disability then. It's becoming a very important issue, is this. So in our report, we discuss the increases in the share of the population reporting having a disability. So we call that disability prevalence. Increasing numbers of people have received disability support payments in the last 5 years in Scotland and in the rest of the UK. Between 2021 and 23-24, the disability prevalence for children in Scotland rose from 6% to 12%, while the percentage of 16 to 64-year-olds or working age individuals rose from 19% to 28%. And the exact reasons for these rises are not yet fully understood, but it's generally thought that there might be two factors in the main that are affecting it. So is a decline in the overall health of the population, which began even before the pandemic, a factor, but with the possible added impact of COVID itself on public health and a decline in the wealth of some households due to that. And the second one is possibly an increased awareness of mental and physical disabilities by the general population. So as a result, more people might now be eligible for and apply for disability support payments across the whole of the UK. So this slide shows the increase in the percentage of people of each age who receive payments in Scotland, England and Wales between 2020 and 2025. And we can see that although the percentage has risen across the UK, the increase has been greater in Scotland for all age groups. And we believe that the larger increase in Scotland is partly due to the introduction of the Child Disability Payment, CDP, in 2021 and the Adult Disability Payment, ADP, in 2022. When these payments were launched, the Scottish Government introduced operational and delivery changes to promote the payments, support the applicants, and improve their experience. And the rise is particularly clear amongst the younger age groups, as you can see on the chart. We can see that in 2020, the percentages of children receiving disability living allowance in Scotland and in England and Wales were very similar. However, by 2025, the percentage of children receiving disability payments in Scotland exceeds that in England and Wales. 3/4 of children receiving support do so for mental or behavioural conditions, and the number of children receiving payments for these conditions has risen from approximately 30,000 in 2021 to 65,000 in 24-25. The percentage of working age adults receiving personal independence payment, PIP, ADP or disability living allowance was already higher in Scotland in 2020, but this percentage has since risen by more in Scotland. And while most new applicants are still over 45, younger adults now account for a larger share than they did before the pandemic. So in Scotland, around 3/4 of children receiving child disability payments successfully apply for adult disability payment at age 16. The increase in children receiving disability payments is likely to lead to a rise in the number of young people receiving working age disability payments, with many continuing to receive support into adulthood. Additionally, people are now less likely to lose their award at review than they were 4 years ago. As a result, people tend to remain on disability payments for longer. This pattern holds across the UK, though the rate at which people exit the payment system after a review is lower in Scotland than it is in England and Wales. We now expect these trends to continue, so we're forecasting that the number of people receiving disability payments in Scotland will exceed 1 million by 2030-31. So in conclusion, funding disability support payments and the impact on other parts of the Scottish budget will be a key item in the new Scottish Government's in-tray following the May election. And we're producing a Scottish Fiscal Commission insight on this tomorrow. So please have a read of that. I'll just quickly cover off some other big ticket items. Obviously, the January 2026 Scottish Spending Review, people will have noticed that there was a commitment to make £1.5 billion of savings. So depending on what happens after the election and what decisions are taken, it will be for the next government to actually decide whereabouts they're going to apply those savings. We have to note that legislative targets to reduce child poverty to less than 10% by 2030, the interim targets have been missed on that. So we be interested to see what happens after the election in terms of how that challenge is going to be met, caught up on, etc. Ellen has mentioned the growing demand on public services. We've talked about increased social security spending, and of course, climate change will require investment and planning to be implemented over the coming years to meet those targets as well. And we've spoken about the housing emergency, which will obviously require significant additional funding over time. So we'll just move on to the next slide, which Ellen is going to do.
Thanks, Justine. So I hope we've given you a flavour over this presentation of the fiscal pressures that the next Scottish Parliament, the next Scottish Government are going to face. Again, I will say we're not, our job here is not to offer commentary on the choices they should make. We're just encouraging people to be realistic and open when they're making, particularly if they're making new commitments, but when they're setting out their manifestos generally, about how they will tackle these fiscal pressures. And the next Scottish Government needs to continue to act to keep Scotland's finances on a sustainable trajectory. There are a lot of pressures here that look like they're growing, and therefore it's not, the next Scottish Government will need to think hard about the actions it will take to ensure that over the next Parliament and beyond, the overall Scottish public finances are sustainable. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand back to Graham now, because we're going to move into Q&A.
Right, excellent. Thanks, Eleanor. Justine, so that gives you an overview. So there's the Slido code to go on and put in your questions. And I see already we've got a really great set of questions. So we'll just try and go through them as many as quickly as possible. We've got about 25 minutes to go, and I might try and group some of the questions where people have asked some questions which are relatively similar. So maybe if I could come to you, Eleanor, because you talked about the workforce, and
Yep.
there's a particular question around how realistic is it that the Scottish Government will shrink the workforce?
So can I say I think it's realistic, but it's not easy. So the plan that the current Scottish Government has set out involves shrinking the workforce by around 0.5% per year over the next Parliament time, or over the spending review period, actually. And that, that is within, if you think about what happens to a public sector workforce in any given year, people leave, people retire, new people start. 0.5% will be significantly lower than the turnover of people in a given year. So it isn't beyond the bounds of possibility to do this at all. But it's not going to happen by accident. It's going to take a sustained effort, and it's not as simple as recruitment freezes and not, and when people leave, you don't replace them, because the gaps will all fall in the wrong places. It's complicated. So in terms of, is it realistic? Yes. Is it something that can simply be done very straightforwardly? No, it's going to take a very sustained effort across government, close monitoring and concerted action across different bits of the public sector to make this happen.
Yes, great. Thanks, Eleanor. And I guess that also feeds into what the context in the wider economy as well, and questions around what is a frontline worker and back office worker, etc. So there's lots of really interesting questions that will make that, as you say challenging. Justine, there's a question about behavioural response and income tax, and maybe you could say a bit about what we mean by behavioural response and income tax, but the particular question about whether or not that's likely to get more significant or less significant over the next few years.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, behavioural responses are extremely difficult to measure, generally speaking, because some of the things that people do to try to not pay additional taxes are largely invisible. So people may decide that they want to put extra money into a pension, or simply do something like not take a promotion, or not defer a bonus, or something like that, so that they're actually earning less money in the term. And also, they might want to go part-time or something like that. So actually, nobody ever writes these reasons down on a bit of paper and submits them to HMRC. So it's quite difficult for people to collect stats on exactly what people's behaviour is. However, if there is a significant uptake, for example, of people putting additional money into a pension via salary sacrifice or something like that, then you could probably decide that a certain amount of that might be attributed to a behavioural response. Other behavioural responses tend to be thought of as physically moving away from the higher tax jurisdiction to a lower tax jurisdiction. How realistic is that? When people live in Scotland and work in Scotland and they have families and they have mortgages and they've got jobs, etc., etc., generally speaking, in the tax world, we don't tend to expect that significant amounts of people will up and move south of the River Tweed. But actually, it is possible for people in higher earnings brackets to decide that they have that choice open to them, whereas generally people with lower earnings tend to stay put.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Justine. So there's a couple of questions I'll maybe combine, and I'll try my best to answer it. And Justine, Mel, you might want to come in as well, just around the outlook for funding and why is then spending tight, but also consequentials that came through for this year in the spring statement. So a couple of things. So this report was written before the spring statement, so it essentially set out the position at that moment in time. It's related to when the budget was set in January. There was then some announcements in the spring statement, particularly around SEND, so special education needs and disabilities in particular, that led to relatively significant Barnett consequentials coming through from next year and then in 28, 29. So a few things about that. So clearly additional block grant means additional funding, which in a sense eases the pressure on the government at the margin. The two things I would say about that is that clearly 2026, 27 was already really tight. The government were planning to use things like ScotWind, use the reserve, etc. So this will ease the pressure, but it's not a silver bullet that is going to ease all the pressures that exist there. Clearly, the government have also got to think about how they respond to additional spending in these areas and whether they follow suit in similar areas around education. So there's a choice there for the government. It doesn't also really help them for not the current financial year or the upcoming financial year, but the year afterwards, where there isn't consequentials coming through, which was one of the really tight years in all of that. So clearly, what we'll see over the course of the spending is more funding coming through in likelihood from things like Barnett consequentials. That's what's happened in the past. But even then, the overall funding outlook is exceptionally tight, which gets to the question about, well, why then, even if it's still increasing in real terms, is spending quite tight in there? Why do we think it's quite challenging? And it's because some of the pressures in spending are rising at an even faster rate than the real terms increase in funding. Eleanor spoke about salaries and wages, which potentially rising faster than inflation, or at least at the same pace as inflation. Pressures in the health service, pressures in public services more broadly, the aging of the population. All of these factors have the potential to increase demand in public services at a rate that is faster than the flow of funds coming in. And that's why the overall balance is quite tight for the government to manage. Okay, so there's a question here about, again, probably builds on your previous answer, Eleanor, around public sector pay. There's a question about how credible are the planned savings and efficiency targets, and maybe you want to take that one.
Okay. I think I'm back in the same sort of territory as I was saying previously. I think it's very helpful that the government has set out these plans. That level of transparency is good. I'm sure the government would be the first to admit that delivery of these it's one thing to write the plan, it's quite another thing to deliver it. And the pay pressures we were talking about are part of the workforce reductions are part of delivering overall efficiencies. The pay deals are part of delivering overall efficiencies. If any part of this goes out of balance, it makes the other parts more challenging to deliver. So again, I would say, how credible are they? Well, they're credible, but the challenge is making sure that you actually work through it. And you need to be aware that whatever you've mapped out can still be derailed by inflation increasing, greater pay pressures, finding difficulties in meeting some of the workforce reductions, as Graham highlighted, the 0.5% of the public sector workforce is across the board. But if you want to continue to put extra staff perhaps in certain areas of public service to meet performance targets, then you're going to have to make deeper cuts in other areas. And all these things taken together, I mean, there's going to be quite a big delivery challenge around this, keeping on top of how well each aspect is being delivered and being ready to adjust and respond to other pressures coming through.
Thanks. Justine, you talked about the increasing disability prevalence. And there's a question here about what's increasing the increase in disability payments. So what are the driving factors behind that? Do you want to maybe just expand a wee bit on what we're seeing in terms of the trends around disability payments?
Yeah, they seem to be driven by, as we said, an increased knowledge of what disabilities actually are. I mean, you've only got to look back 20 years, and there were certain conditions that the general public weren't really largely aware it existed. Now there's a much greater awareness of those conditions, whether they're mental or physical. And also the greater amount of help that is being offered by government departments to people in terms of how they can claim, what they can claim for, helping them with the applications and helping them understand the system, etc., etc. So there is that, and I think it's got to be combined as well. We have to sort of take account of the fact that the state of the public health in Scotland is also a worrying factor, and people are sort of falling ill. We've got an aging population as well, so we've got, in addition to people who fall ill or are diagnosed with a condition when they're young, and when they're in working age, we've also got an increasing amount of people year on year on year that's not looking set to change very much in terms of the aging population, and with age comes disability, illness, etc.
Yeah, thanks, Justine. And I think this gets into some of the other questions that we see as well around, you mentioned public health and well-being in there. And I think that one of the differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK is the point you make about the ageing of the population. And you saw in the chart that Justine walked through that the prevalence of disability understandably increases with age. We're seeing something really quite interesting and worrying for young people and a jump up there, but historically disability prevalence increases as we get older. What we do know over the next 10 to 15 years is that the average age in Scotland will increase more rapidly than in the rest of the UK. We'll have a greater proportion of people aged 75 and above in Scotland and the UK. So then, all else remaining equal, you will expect to see a higher growth in disability payments in Scotland relative to the UK, simply from the age of the population before the rest of the UK catches up. And that's one of the reasons why we're potentially seeing some differences between Scotland and in the rest of the UK over time. The other factor which we also spoke about was the different system in Scotland, and the potentially more supportive, inclusive system that is encouraging people to take up benefits. I think we estimate around about 35,000 more people on adult disability payment in Scotland now than would have been if we had had the same trends that we were seeing through personal independent payments in England and in England, Wales. And Justine, that I guess comes back to your point about greater awareness of these issues, greater encouragement and support for systems to have more people moving into those sorts of payments. Okay, great. So, Justine, there's a particular question about the tax-based performance gap
All
and
right.
why we only start in 2016 and why we don't do it many years before. Do you want to explain it? I mean, I can explain this, the technical reason why we start in 2016, but do you want to maybe explain a bit more just about the tax-based performance gap and why we're seeing it change since 2016?
Yeah, well, essentially, in simple terms, the devolved taxes began, around 10 years ago, and so it's only since then that there's been a devolved income tax or partially devolved income tax situation in Scotland. So I think it's right and the fair thing to do since that time is to look at how Scotland's tax base is performing compared to how it would have performed had things stayed as they were. So that's a sort of very simplistic outline of it, Graham. I don't know if you need any more detail from me on that,
No,
or
I think,
if you want to.
and I think that's spot on. And I think from a purely technical point of view, because 2016-17 was the first year of devolution, everything that had gone before was essentially wiped because we were made no better or worse off. So that is the starting point. So what's ever happened in the past and about relative performance doesn't really matter because we were no better or worse off. It's everything that happens from that point onwards, which is why we go back to 2016-17. I mean, as more years go on, we're starting to think about how we might change or at least give two sorts of explanations that look back all the way back to this tax devolution, but give people a bit more of an idea about how things are happening in the here and now, because clearly things that are bedded in take over time. And I think one of the things that we've done, which is quite interesting, is try and unpick some of the reasons for that. And there's some interesting things about things in the northeast of Scotland and the relative high earnings employment that is potentially being lost or at least not growing as much as it's done in the past. That has an impact. And all the work you were talking about the fiscal drag effects as well are really interesting about that relative tax base, which is all thrown into the mix. Great. Eleanor, you talked a bit about living standards and what is underpinning the weak growth in living standards. I don't know whether you want to say a wee bit more about that. And you kind of talked a bit about some of the issues that are happening at the moment in the Middle East and how that might feed through. But I don't know whether you want to maybe expand on some of the factors that are driving that weak growth in living standards.
Well, I can try. I'm sure you'll jump in as well, Graham. I think there was also someone asking about what did those figures mean? I thought I saw a question about that. So the figures that we had on the chart were about real terms growth in disposable income per person. What are the factors in that? Well, there's how pay changes or how salaries and incomes change over time. There are tax and changes and so on. I think I'm going to look at Claire now, but I think we take account of certain costs. What do we take out for disposable income? Do we take housing costs into account, Claire?
So I think the measure that's used is real household disposable income. So it's looking at income after tax, after national insurance, but it includes things like social security payments as well. So it's household total income. And I don't think that measure is after housing costs. You can take a measure after housing costs, which
that's not the one we've been using. So apologies, I didn't know that. But anyway, what we're talking about is the income coming in. So as Claire mentioned, also if you receive social security, that goes into your household income. And it's real terms disposable income. So we are talking about after we take account of inflation here. And we know that that's why I was highlighting that what's happening in the Middle East, and that may push up inflation, may drive down those real terms disposable income growth, which we were already seeing was going to be quite low. It could be still lower if inflation is rising faster than the incomes, the household income rises. We saw that there was a big impact from the global financial crisis. I don't think it will be news to anyone on the call that living standards have been under pressure, that costs have been rising, that people have often struggled for the income to keep pace with the costs of the basic necessities of life. So that's really all that's behind that. It's trying to make to look at the economic performance, but through a household lens. So, and the way that you improve this over time, yes, okay, you can tweak your policy landscape around social security and tax and so on, but you actually ultimately the way that you improve this is through economic performance, and there being more money in the system, and the household incomes overall rising.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Eleanor. Yeah, and I think the bit that Pumi put on the call from our heard us talk a lot about is underlying productivity in the economy and how that then generates wealth through higher wages, and that in turn is one of the key drivers of that disposable income. And again, that's one of the things that we just keep on highlighting is, and it's in the in tray of the next government, is how do you actually get economic growth motoring, and with very limited controls over things like migration and population and labour market, then the key is that productivity bit, which is the kind of the thing that we keep on coming back to and emphasising. Okay, so there's just looking at the couple of questions about interactions. I mean, I think it was you, Ellen, talked about the interaction between Scottish Spend and Services, so universal credit. So you spoke explicitly about the PIP changes and then the two-child limit, but the questioner extends that a bit onto, well, this also has implications for some areas of public spending as well. So not just social security, but has knock-on implications into things like the third sector or into health. Can you maybe just talk a bit more about the interactions between UK government policies and the Scottish fiscal framework and budget?
Surely. I mean, we haven't included here we have a slide where we try to explain all the different moving parts around the fiscal framework, and we haven't included it because it takes a little while to explain, and time is short. But the block grant is determined by UK government decisions. The block grant adjustments are really determined by UK government decisions. And if you remember all the way back to Justine's slide right at the beginning on funding and spending with those bars, the block grant and the block grant adjustments are by far the biggest determinant of the overall funding available. And then, of course, Scottish Government's decisions and Scottish economic performance and so on are also factors, and that does come through. But such a large proportion of the funding is driven by UK government decisions, and that then has all kinds of knock-on consequences, because you have to think about once you then take decisions on funding priorities in Scotland, but the funding available to you is being driven by other factors, you're always having to think about what the knock-on effects might be. I'm not sure if the questioner was also thinking that if UK decisions on social security, the non-devolved parts of social security, wind up having a knock-on effect in Scotland, increasing demand. That may well be part of it. Obviously, at that point, there are mechanisms built into the fiscal framework for the Scottish Government and the UK Government to agree to compensate one another for costs that their decisions impose. You can just about imagine Scottish Government doing something which might then impose a cost on the UK. You can easily imagine UK Government doing something like cutting social security benefits, which might impose costs in Scotland. And then there is a conversation to be had between the governments, and there are mechanisms built in, but they're not straightforward, and it can get quite complicated and, dare I say, contentious to work through what the impact should be and whether any adjustment in funding is required. And yes, of course, that's all happening at the global level, but on the front line then there's a whole set of pressures about funding available for the third sector or for public services that might be put under pressure.
Great, thanks, Eleanor. And so there's probably just time for just one really final question, which I'll try and give a wee bit of an outline about timing, which is what we might expect from a new incoming government in all of that. I mean, clearly we'll have the manifesto commitments, it will set out priorities, so we wait to see what they are going to say in that. Returning back to Eleanor's very first point about the importance of understanding and being aware of that fiscal context. Clearly, the Scottish Government have set out a spending review. The current Scottish Government has set a spending review, so that gives us insights about what the current administration might want to prioritise and focus upon if they were to remain, if they were to come back into government. Clear, if it was a different government, then they would work through the process of thinking about setting out a budget, which we would expect toward the end of the year. There's opportunity for them potentially to think about what they might do within the year, but that's obviously, we'll already be within the financial year. So you'd expect them starting to think carefully about what they might do to set out their budget, which would be toward the end of the year for 27, 28. And we'd expect all of that start to come together when Parliament returns and there's a programme for government and we've got a bit more clarity. And of course, whenever government starts to set out that thinking, that's when we'll update our reports, we'll do our fiscal update. And later on in the summer, which will set out the overall context, and then we'll do our work to support the budget process as it moves toward the end of the year. And with that, I just really wanted to thank everyone for joining us. Also to thank Eleanor, Justine and Claire for being on hand to talk us through our work, but also to answer the questions. This will be the final update from us before the election. So we'll also follow the pre-election guidance from the 26th of March. Before then, we will be publishing our final insights works. So do keep an eye on them as they continue to come out. And then we'll see you once we have a new Parliament and we have a new government in place, and we'll then be continuing our work of fiscal scrutiny and forecasting to help support public policy in Scotland. So thanks so much everyone for joining us, and look forward to see you all soon.